Hello, this is the third of a series of videos about the fundamental theories and practices that should always be considered when creating a computer-assisted language learning environment. Theories that are based on widely accepted educational research and theory and practice. The videos were originally recorded for use in one particular class, but I'm making them available for other people also. So in this video, we're talking about the fourth, fifth, and sixth of the 9 foundational theoretical concepts that we identified via the methodology described in the first video of this series. And what we're talking about this time are communicative language theory, authentic learning materials and experiences, and incremental learning. Students rarely study a foreign language simply for self-improvement. Rather, they generally have utilitarian motivations. They have a specific reason that they are learning the language and the way they expect to use the language. It might be a professional qualification for a job they want, or the desire to travel, or just that they have to pass the course to graduate from school. Communicative language teaching, based on communicative language theory, is an approach that emphasizes interaction both as the means and the ultimate goal of learning a language. It dovetails well with the practical perspective of the learners because it emphasizes actual communication, such as between two people, even if that communication does not use perfect grammar or elevated vocabulary. Communication and communicative competency has been defined as a skill needed in the 21st century by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So today's understanding of the need for communicative competence comes from 21st century needs and contexts, as opposed to earlier 20th century frameworks. There was still communication back in the 20th century, but how we communicate and the channels we use are new and often different today. Sandra Savignon, an early author in CLT, has more recently observed that language is inseparable from social behavior and social identity, such that language defines communities, while communities define the forms and the use of language. Now that's kind of complex, but she says, therefore, that language can be seen as culture in motion. Her observation implies that the fact that people in so many cultures speak English as a first or second language means that older ideas of native speakers as the ideal language users, that's less valuable today. Many people use English, and there is no one perfect way to use English. So CLT is a learning framework that uses a lot of interpersonal communication and uses them in real life circumstances, or as close as we can get to real life circumstances. So CLT is natural learning, and long-term use of CLT can facilitate teaching of vocabulary and idioms and other aspects of language. And these are things that students might miss in the more traditional and less natural academic setting. I observed an example of CLT several years ago when I led a class of American students to Taiwan. As part of their visit, they learned Mandarin. After preparation in the classroom, the students were assigned to go to a nearby McDonald's restaurant and order lunch completely in Chinese. Because they were well prepared, the students succeeded, and that improved their competence. So long-term use of CLT can facilitate the teaching of vocabulary and idioms and other aspects. And as I said, it's probably in a better way because it's natural rather than the older traditional memorize and take tests format. This focus on conveying meaning leads to considerably different instructional strategies compared to teaching that emphasizes technical accuracy like verb use and grammar and punctuation and all that. We first focus on understanding people and being able to make yourself understood. Technical accuracy is maybe relevant for the more advanced language students. EFL learners are often surprised when I tell them that native speakers do not always use perfect grammar. Sometimes they even use the wrong words for something, or at least the wrong pronunciation of the words they think they're using. In using CLT, we can appeal to the utilitarian motivations of students to encourage them to spend more time studying English. And if they spend more time, they'll have better outcomes in the long run. So because it is more relevant to the motivations of students, CLT is a fitting component of the standard model of CALL. The next of our major categories, major theories, is authentic learning materials and experiences. Today's academic literature, considered very broadly, shows that students really do desire authentic and interactive course materials. We call this organic learning. It's a metaphor referring to language learning that's natural, without being forced, without artificial characteristics. When learning a second or foreign language, even a little bit of success and authentic interaction in the target language will cause students to have more confidence in what they've learned, to be more motivated to learn, and to be more motivated for cross-cultural interaction. In the past, it was hard for teachers to find suitable cross-cultural materials. But by the early 2000s, it became clear that use of the internet and technology could help provide these rich and authentic materials and experiences for the EFL learning. Of course, technology has the potential to provide those authentic materials, but we always have to remember it's not just the technology being used, but how it is used that makes the big difference. I like that term, organic learning. In the food industry, organic means that the food is raised naturally, no pesticides and things like that for animals, no growth hormones injected. But I use it as a metaphor referring to language learning that is natural without being forced or contrived and without artificial characteristics. Here's an important caution, however. Original texts may be too complicated for students, both in vocabulary and grammar, and also in ideas about culture. So I agree with O'Donnell, who wrote in 2009 that modified, if you will, children's versions of notable texts, books, stories, or such things created by native speaking authors, but with EFL students in mind, can often be beneficial because they allow the instructors to manage the level of difficulty for the particular class, wherever they are in their education. If these unaltered original texts are used, they have to be very carefully selected to meet the learning needs of the students. It reminds me of a student I knew in Taiwan who was fascinated by the famous novel Dracula, but she was reading a simplified version. In America, it's not unusual to have a simplified version of a classic novel that's suitable for young students, say junior high students, to read. Such texts for EFL learners should, I think, also be relatively recent in the cultural elements they talk about. Now, American children are often provided with simplified versions of historical works. Dracula, that we talked about, Robinson Crusoe, Swiss Family Robinson, Treasure Island, Gulliver's Travels, there are many of them. But EFL learners would likely consider these original works, in some cases, to be too complicated in their use of language, but EFL learners might also think that they are outdated in terms of understanding native culture today. When we're talking about literature, for example, even when simplified versions are used, enrichment of the texts is needed to check the cultural understanding of the students and provide a basis for constructivist activities that come out of the text. Just as incremental learning is applied to the degree of linguistic difficulty of a text, it should also be applied, I think, to the difficulty of cultural understanding as embodied in the text. How challenging are the cultural elements of the story, and how will they be for EFL learners to compare and contrast with their own culture? And I'll talk more about this in just a moment. Here's an example of how authentic literature for EFL learning experienced a problem. You may recognize this book. I think it's often used in teaching English via literature. Culture as portrayed in literature may not always be accurate because of literary points the author intends to make, but that can leave students with misunderstandings about the target culture. And teachers have to be able to understand and explain those misunderstandings. I encountered a really serious misunderstanding when teaching a classic short story, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, to Taiwan college students. Almost every student in the class concluded that the New England villagers in the story were unfair and immoral because they chose to stone a fellow citizen to death to ensure good crops, which never happens in real life. It was certainly the intent of the author, but for many of the students, they also assume that those events do happen in the real world in New England today, until both myself and the Taiwanese instructor I was working with stressed the differences between the fictional text and reality. So students were confused because the author advanced her artistic purpose through a metaphor that did not mirror reality. And it required just a more nuanced understanding than the Taiwanese students reading it possessed. If the teachers had not understood the full intention of the author and the full reality of American culture, that misunderstanding might have lasted and been a problem. Using authentic texts and materials and experiences dovetails well with constructivism and communicative language theory. Learning designers must take great care in selecting authentic materials, however, because it's easy to select materials that are too difficult for students who have limited language proficiency and limited cultural understanding, because that can reduce motivation. We need to think of authentic materials and experiences in terms of affordances. One particular material may have an affordance of excellent language use, but the cultural ideas may be too complex. Others may have beneficial insight into culture, but be too complex in the way it's written. Just like struggling to learn a strange technology does not feel authentic, struggling with content that's too difficult, maybe advanced language or advanced cultural ideas, is also demotivating and will cause students to study less. And that leads to the next component of the standard model. Researchers have found that when a learning task is perceived by students as being too difficult, they become demotivated. I mentioned that a moment ago. Such research suggests that teachers must select learning tasks carefully to move the students beyond their current proficiency level in a way that is incremental. That means step by step, a little bit at a time, and thus will not be perceived as too challenging at any single step for the students to succeed. Children who are English native speakers learn to read, for example, first by learning just a few words and then reading them in short sentences that come from that very limited vocabulary. In reading, this means as students continue to read over time, teachers add new vocabulary slowly and carefully, allowing the students to learn the meaning of the new words from the context of the sentence and the paragraph, from illustrations that may accompany the text, and from sounding out the letters of the word. So applying the sounds of the individual letters to determine the pronunciation of the entire word. And often asking for external help, like asking what a word means from parents or teachers. And again, this is similar to how we all learn to speak, adding more and more words to our vocabulary over time and understanding the meaning of the words as we go along. Here's an example from the book that I first learned to read many years ago when I was in first grade in grade school. All of the stories were about characters named Dick, Jane, and Sally, and about their pet dog Spot and their pet cat Puff. We started learning by knowing just a few words, and the stories were constructed with just these few words. But over time, as we learned more words, the stories would get more elaborate. Now, Dick, Jane, and Sally texts are no longer used in school in the United States. Today, we know that there are things that authors could have done better, for example, like showing more racial and cultural diversity. But still, as an example, they fit well with how a child learns to read naturally. This fundamental concept of incremental learning, I think, resonates with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which refers to the distance between a student's current knowledge and ability and the student's future potential. And the two can be bridged by social interaction with people who are more experienced, people with other experiences, Vygotsky said. So learning by speaking and listening, communicating with others, reading what others have written, writing to them, and writing, I know, is the hardest of the skills, but this social interaction that promotes learning. Incremental learning, I think, also resonates with the theory of scaffolding that we talked about in a previous video, in which teachers initially give high levels of support, but slowly withdraw that support from students to encourage them to become more independent. And I think incremental learning also resonates with Krashen, who proposed what he called the input hypothesis. He said language and literacy develop when learners understand the messages they receive, and he called that comprehensible input, but comprehensible just means understandable input. And then they learn subconsciously by filling in the gaps of occasional new words or understanding better grammar to be better understood. So Krashen said that teachers should challenge language learners with tasks that are only slightly above their current level of proficiency, their current knowledge and ability. And I think we can extend that meaning to the learning materials and experiences so that are only slightly beyond the current ability of the students, a little bit, but not so far that it's demotivating. Now, Krashen's input hypothesis has been criticized, but I think the overarching contribution he made is highlighting that role of input in learning, the messages we receive in language learning for instructional materials and experiences, with emphasis on content rather than simply form, on communicating, being understood, rather than just grammar and spelling and punctuation, the technical things like that. And by doing that, I think Krashen is right that provides inspiration to language learners, and researchers and learning designers can benefit from that. So we are continually challenging students, but just a little bit at a time. We're ensuring that the task is only slightly beyond the previous ones to preserve motivation and make learning more natural. We're helping students fit new information in with old, and we shouldn't try to move students too quickly in learning tasks, particularly tasks that are too difficult and thus are motivating. And again, that makes use of constructivist theory. Incremental learning does resonate, I'm convinced, with constructivist theory that learning consists of fitting new knowledge together with what's already known. These mental knowledge structures are known as schema, but they're mental structures of experience and understanding that provide an organized way of perceiving and responding to new information, a complex situation. So an important job of the teacher is, again, helping the students fit new information into existing knowledge and make as many connections as possible. So therefore, new knowledge has to be introduced to the students step by step, not with too much at a time, so that we can facilitate the students making connections between new and existing knowledge. And this applies to all kinds of learning, but I hope you see how it applies to learning the 4 English skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And so therefore, incremental learning is a worthy part of the standard model of CALL. In our next video, we will consider the 3 final theories in the standard model of CALL instructional design. They are task-based learning, gamification, and long-term use via curriculum integration. Now, students who are viewing this video for a class should think about what we've talked about and be prepared to have thoughtful, interesting things to say in class. Your teacher may also give you some specific questions to address. I want to thank you for watching. I will be back in 2 more videos.